Hi everyone. So the collaborative study guide they created did not go exactly as I'd planned, although I do appreciate the one student who added some stuff in there. There was not very much of a collaborative effort. So I've decided to switch gears and I created this study guide 2.0 that's really just a collection of the course competencies and learning objectives that have been included at the top of each module on the module overview pages. These are the things that I've used to organize the content that's included in each module. So being able to review and understand these main concepts and terms should prepare you as best as possible for the quiz itself. The quiz is worth 40 points. The majority of those points are going to be coming out of modules 1 and 2, but this does not mean that the other ones are not also important and also included to a certain extent within the course, the questions that will be on the quiz. So take that as you will. I'm going to just give a kind of general overview of each of the important things I consider from each module as a sort of study guide to help you all prepare for the quiz. So within Module 1, this is when we focused on an introduction to and history of anthropology. I would expect you to be able to define anthropology, define its 4 subdisciplines, and give me some examples of what those are. So the 4 subdisciplines being sociocultural anthropology, biological, physical / evolutionary anthropology, that all being the same second subdiscipline, linguistics, as well as archaeology. Those are the 4 subdisciplines, be able to define or explain those. Using the holistic approach and the concept of culture. Well, culture is everything. It's the way we're raised, the sorts of behaviors and beliefs that we have, the practices we engage in on a regular basis that are determined across or by our culture, the culture within which we're raised. So using holistic approach within anthropology means considering all of those factors in our understanding and interpretations of different cultures. We read Miner's piece on the Nasi Rema, which was a fun critique of anthropology itself, at least as it stood in the 1950s when the piece was written. He describes these sort of ritual practices of the Nasi Rema, which in reality was 1950s America, as a way of kind of drawing attention to the exoticism we use in anthropology of the other, defining and explaining these sorts of daily rituals that we engage in our culture from an edict perspective, as if we were an outsider looking in on this strange culture that was being described in the article. It was also a way to kind of check our ethnocentrism and engage in a more cultural relativistic practice and perspective on things, that no culture is better or worse than any other culture. It just needs to be understood within its own terms and within its own conditions. This also relates to those 4 sort of ideas: emic versus edict perspective, an insider versus outsider's view on things. The idea of reflexivity, being able to recognize and check our own biases when interpreting another culture. A general history of anthropology, the important figures and changing ideas that are involved in that. We talked about Charles Darwin and Lubbock's ideas, social Darwinism as being, not a completely accurate perspective. Transitioning into Franz Boas, who's seen as the father of American anthropology, and went on to educate a lot of the other prominent anthropologists that have defined the field since then. This also ties into the sort of racist perspective or history involved in colonialist ideas, justifications for slavery in the 18th and 19th century, drew on, unfortunately, a lot of these social Darwinist ideas, and luckily that perspective has been abandoned. We don't view things in that way anymore. We've abandoned this sort of cultural evolution perspective that each society has to pass through certain stages of development in order to achieve this penultimate social advancement, and that's just not the case. From a modern evolutionist perspective nowadays, we recognize that each culture has its own unique trajectory based on its conditions and context within which it takes place. So that's the overview for Module 1. Module 2, we talked about how and why we study death. There were several theoretical perspectives we covered. I've listed a few of them here from the lecture during that week. When it came to Durkheim, he's viewed death as this sort of challenge to social cohesion of human societies. He promoted the use of scientific methods within his research and really helped us to start considering religion and death as from within the field of sociology, which is what we borrow it from in anthropology. We talked about Hertz. He discussed death as a two-phase process, and that's something we returned to just this last week, discussing the wet versus dry medium of the human remains and how that sort of impacts the mourning process that we go through, also the rituals involved in dealing with the decomposing body versus the dried remains, the bones, or the ashes left behind after cremation. He was an early proponent of embodiment, which is this concept that the human body is an expression of the social values of the culture within which it takes place. We can contrast this a bit. Well, not really contrast. We can see how this is related to the concept of a social identity. This is your personal sense of who you are and why, which is very important in death studies because our identities impact our life course, but they also need to be understood within their socio-historical context. Van Gennep was another one of these early theoreticians, and I'm giving you a big winky face here because this would be a really important person to go back and look at, especially his concept of the rites of passage. Very important for the quiz to go back and look at what rites of passage are. I would expect you to be able to explain to me what the 3 stages are: separation, transition, and reincorporation, and explain how this concept is relevant to the study of death and dying. Okay, Victor Turner elaborated a bit more on this rites of passage concept from Van Gennep, especially the term for liminality. This is that sort of betwixt, in between. You're not really here or there. You're in between death and whatever comes after. He talked a lot about this, the roles of symbolism involved in that. And then the last major theoretical contribution we talked about in the lecture was Maurice Bloch, but not someone I would be too concerned with. Again, I would focus more on Van Gennep and some of the other earlier people that came before him. That week, we also talked about the comparative framework that we use to evaluate death across cultures. So these are the concepts of social organization and stratification, so the patterns of relationships between and among people. We also talked about ideology and worldview. This is the way people view and understand their world. And this involves, or not involves, but is expressed in different ways. We've talked about iconography, actual ritual, and religion itself as expressions of worldview. The identity of different individuals, these tend to accumulate and shift throughout their throughout one's life course. You can imagine how you move into different phases of life, and there's different responsibilities and identities that come with that. We talked about biological versus social identity and how those differ. And then lastly, health. Bioarchaeologists for past societies and health professionals nowadays help us to understand more about sickness, disease, and aging as it relates to the death experience. All right, with Module 3, the major focus of that module was Philippe Arias's piece on the hour of our death, and I actually went ahead and included a PDF of a chapter from his book that provides greater context than maybe I was able to get into in the lecture for that module. So I would recommend going back, reading through that, listening to the lecture again, focusing on his 4 themes that he looks at. He focuses on what we call the awareness of the individual, defense of society against the untamed nature, belief in the afterlife, and belief in the existence of evil. And so he traces those themes through history and through these sort of 5 generalized models that he talks about to understand how our perspectives and our conceptualizations of death have changed throughout Western history, at least Western perspective only in this regard. The 5 models in particular that he talks about, and you should be aware of: the tame death, death of the self, remote and imminent death, death of the other, and nowadays what we call the invisible death. So the sort of patterns you should be noticing are, this pattern trend in families, close relatives being the ones who are taking care of a sick or dying individual. They're the ones who prepare the body earlier on, whereas nowadays we've transitioned to all of this being done outside the home. Funeral homes, hospitals, healthcare professionals, these are the people who take care of our sick and dying loved ones rather than us nowadays. It's created this sort of separation between us and that phase of life, which has created all sorts of other difficulties in terms of how we process these experiences and how we prepare ourselves to go through them ourselves. Many people are much more afraid of death nowadays than we were in the past, when it was all around you and you couldn't necessarily escape it. It was much more part of daily life in the past. Within Module 3, we also looked at a lot of different secular practices in terms of death rites. There are humanist groups that will come and give, life celebrations, other secular rites designed to be however the deceased wants them to be. Cremation is an option that's gained more popularity in recent history. It provides a more ideologically neutral ritual to not dispose of the body, but to transition the body into ash that would allow for a more privatized ritual. You can go to a place that was significant to the deceased or to you both to deposit their remains in a peaceful manner, things like this. We also touched briefly on cryogenics and some of these other environmentally friendly options there are now for burial practices within what might be considered more secular societies. And very briefly touched on digital afterlife, so uploading yourself to the cloud, which is still a bit experimental at this point, but a lot of people have theorized on what it's going to be like. Module 4, we talked about grief. So this grief in general is the emotional responses that we have to death. This includes both personal and social dynamics. We discussed ideas about getting back to normal or getting well again. In our discussion that week, we talked about, is grief seen as a mental illness, or is it just a part of life? To a certain degree, you can return to a sense of normalcy, but most people tend to be quite impacted by the death of a loved one. Not all grief looks the same. We talked about different external versus internal processes and looked at a few different examples of societies that have much more expressive, outward outpourings of emotion. The Maori, for example, also professional mourners who can be hired to come in and wail and cry all night in terms of, showing the importance of that person. Time as a healer, that was another concept we talked about that week. Bereavement periods tend to vary based on the relationship someone has to the deceased. So for example, mothers who lose a child, we don't even have a term for what that is. And it's such a taboo subject. People don't know how to discuss it, don't want to discuss it, don't feel comfortable in these sort of situations where they're dealing with a mother who's bereaved. We also talked about stages of grief. This sort of concept that's become popular in psychology is very, very much oversimplistic when it comes to the actual experience of mourning. You don't really move from A to B to C. People are all over the place, and you might not experience all stages of grief. Or anyway, it's just a very, very much more individualized experience than can be captured within one theoretical framework. We talked about individuality as a new and interesting sort of perspective that came out of Davies, the textbook. It talks about there being no clear separation between the individual and society. There's a individual person is seen as being much more dynamic and interactive as an entity. Our essence doesn't necessarily leave the society. It's always kind of flowing in and out of our bodies. So as we die, we're no longer physically there, but our essence is still a part of the society because life must go on. We read and talked about Rosaldo's piece on grief and a headhunter's rage, which I hope you found to be quite interesting. And I will do my best to grade that this week, tonight if I can. But I just wanted to reiterate a few of the important things that I hope you took away from that reading and that activity. You should have noticed that Rosaldo's perspective on loss and grief changed after his wife died accidentally while in the field. It was then that he was able to understand this sort of rage that the Ilongot feel when a loved one dies. He saw his explanation of what he went through as a way of helping Western readers to understand this violent practice that the Ilongot engage in. What he was trying to help us to understand is that headhunting served as a culturally defined outlet for this intense rage and emotional volatility that the Ilongot experience. And for them, the only way to get over that was to, cut off the head of someone else so that they could physically toss this head, which was a symbolic way of just releasing everything, releasing their grief, tossing away all their burdens, this sort of understanding. Rosaldo also wanted to point out, we often ignore the emotions that are experienced by survivors, so it's important for us to not only focus on what happens with the dead body, how that dead person's remembered, but the experience that the mourners are going through as well. And lastly, one thing I hope you understood from the piece was that he himself understood and was trying to reiterate to to other anthropologists, that the perspective of the anthropologists themselves can influence their interpretations. So it wasn't until he experienced such a significant loss himself that he was able to gain that sort of emic perspective and gain a bit more understanding from an insider's view of why the Ilongot participated in this practice. Okay. Lastly, Module 5, which was just last week, we talked about the rituals of death. So your textbook talked quite a bit about, funeral homes as this trend that I mentioned earlier of a shift in care for the dying and dead from being family members to these things being taken care of outside of the home. The funeral home offers, this sort of homey feel for mourning to take place within. Your textbook also talked about these three concepts that I have listed here: impurity, fear, and fertility, and how this influences the way humans respond to death. So it would be important to go back and review those concepts. The power of the ancestors. We watched the video of the TED Talk looking at one interesting, I cannot remember the name of the culture itself right now, but in Southeast Asia, looking at a very interesting mortuary ritual that takes quite a bit longer period of time for the person to actually enter into the ground or into the cave where they spent eternity. We also looked at and talked about mortuary rituals having a very deep history, and that they do occur across other species. Humans are not the only ones who participate in mortuary rituals. And finally, I had you read Hayslip et al.'s piece on the American funeral. And it was my hope that you would gain an understanding of the fact that the American funeral doesn't necessarily reflect the sort of regional, ethnic, and socioeconomic diversity we have here in the United States nowadays. It's been very standardized and regulated in terms of how funerals take place nowadays. The factors contributing to that include economics, psychological perspectives, as well as sociocultural sociological explanations that factor into how funerals are designed and actually take place nowadays in the United States. So that wraps up this very brief review session and overview of what we've covered up to this point. If you have any other questions about the the quiz itself, or the content we've covered up to this point in the semester, then don't hesitate to contact me via Canvas inbox or directly through email. Good luck!